Online fake news is an existential threat to democracy, not because most people believe bogus content, but because of the corrosive effect it has on trust among citizens and their faith in democratic institutions representing them, according to a new study. Trust is a very old issue. How do you set up a system that allows the ability for people to reliably know who is trustworthy and who is not? In the past, a lot of this was done by person-to-person interactions. You trusted Pam down the road because you've lived by her all your life and have a lot of historical data on her. That allows you to trust Abby, who you haven't spent as much time with but Pam vouches for. These things have become more complicated as the sources of information have gotten further and further from us. I think this is where education kicks in. I don't think there is a perfect way to remedy this, but I think if we took educating our young for the internet age, it would help tremendously. Anecdotal, but a good many of the sub-26-year-olds know use the internet twice as much as most 50+ and have no idea how it actually works. Education as a whole is doing terrible in me country, the United States. While almost no dedicated course to learning how to maneuver what is functionally half of our lives, the internet. Edit. Words for those who would rather discuss semantic instead of contribute to the discussion. Sources of information are never necessarily trustworthy. Information itself is only trustworthy, and only then once someone has developed a sufficient level of understanding so as to trust in non-contradiction can that be expected. Until then, we necessarily have to believe in people. Typically our family or peer group and those we identify as same. It's all very primitive and independent of any internal logic. A proper system, and there's actually a science of complex systems. Cybernetics or N. Wikipedia, org or wiki or cybernetics depends as little on people as possible. An example would be trusting or believing in your math teacher predominantly because your peers or parents believed in your teachers and learning rote addition. You don't understand mathematics when you begin adding, but because mathematics is a non-contradictory system, you can begin to sufficiently understand and trust it as a subsystem, and not because you need to keep trusting that one teacher. Math is a fairly extreme example. Stray into government or art or biology classes, and it's still pretty common for people to maintain beliefs that they think are valid, yet are flawed due to flawed teaching. They don't exactly trust their teacher still, but they trusted them for long enough that the beliefs have gained enough inertia, so to speak, that they can't be easily rectified. That is why I like science. The shortcut to trust is demonstrate in reality. It takes an awful lot of coincidence for our understanding of physics to be totally wrong, but all of our computers to work. Perhaps, but it's a lot easier to find out if Abby is a psychopath hiding bodies in her basement now. This also becomes a double-edged sword as technology progresses. It becomes easier to frame Abby as the psychopath hiding bodies in her basement even if it's not true. The truth is that the power structure that presents information to the public is losing its power and control. I would much rather live in a world where everyone knows that all information is propaganda than a world where everyone has blind faith. Well, 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 oh, well, 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 well. It pushes people to do their own research and will ultimately lead to a better informed society with diversity of thought. The real danger of lies is not that we would come to believe them. It's that after being lied to enough, it becomes harder and harder to identify the truth. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e., the reality of experience and the distinction between true and false, the standards of thought no longer exist. Hannah Arendt. I actually wrote a short essay for a class about a year ago where I make this argument, saying what we're witnessing has little to do with vaccines or COVID or any of that, but with trust, and specifically a decline in trust that I argue started with Nixon, which also happens to roughly coincide with the birth of modern AI. I have been having thoughts about just giving into the dark side, because all those people are just so blissfully unaware. They are happy. God, how much I miss that. Not knowing about threat the media in me country has made to democracy. It's going downhill fast. It's not a recession. Inflation is transitory. No evidence of human-to-human transmission. The public trust has been eroded. The best way to combat misinformation is to teach critical thinking, especially toward media consumption. People will have to self-determine what is real, not private companies or governments. The media don't want you to be critical of it. They want to ban the information they don't like and censor sources that don't fit the narrative. They are open about this. It is why people don't trust them anymore. They have ruined their credibility. Maybe our governments should quit lying and deceiving us constantly. They talk about being transparent and caring about people, but are just giant hypocrites trying to make themselves rich by manipulating the economy and people who support them. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. To the man behind the curtain, nowhere to the down shoot. You mean I can't just redefine the word recession and claim everything is fine? If you don't believe our lies, you're threatening democracy. In the two-party system is also largely to blame. Citizens may come to view laws, processes, or even the democratic system itself as no longer worthy of respect. So this is innately political but genuinely mean to ask a question. The implication is that people stop respecting the democratic systemic government due to a sort of general effect of lies being so common that we don't know who to trust anymore. It seems far more likely to me that people are losing respect in such institutions because, to be frank, they keep directly lying to us. Online propaganda is just a new spin on an old technique of destroying society from within with rumors and lies. A little more than a new spin, I think. It gave the old techniques superpowers. When governments lie, they bury their lies each successive government. The problem is now that the pit they threw them all in is overflowing, and with the internet many more eyes are watching. It's nothing to do with destroying society from within and everything to do with the dynamics of power and those that have power, which is the government. How they use that power is what causes those lies to need burying in the first place. Just look at any number of governments around the world. They're obsessed with controlling the people they govern. To them, those millions. It's a miracle they all fall into line like tin soldiers every day. Corporate-owned media has manipulated the public for years, but this is the exact sentiment that is being pointed out. The problem is we never had the ability to know this. Now we do. It's one thing being lied to, and it's another thing knowing you're being lied to. Citizens shouldn't have trust on institutions and democracy, because as soon as there is that trust, it becomes beneficial for those institutions to take advantage of it. Always remain critical and vigilant. Removed, 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 removed. The problem is the government not being faithful. That's why people don't trust them. Because in a number of cases, the government, or at least the politicians, who make legislation and policy, is almost 100 owned by corporate interests, so they are serving those corporate masters rather than the general population. So they are being totally faithful to their masters, but not to you. Removed. The idea that media used to be free and unbiased is such a fantasy. It's a great example of the Luron generation concept. While true, the problem is also that the government, or at least some entities, have their own vested interest that is different from a lot of people. Media is always either controlled by the government, controlled by the very rich, or controlled by the editor who also has an agenda. Apart from news wires like app, I believe every other news source has a slant. So as you read the news, you must be aware of the inherent bias. Even so, the news is written by journalists and reporters, each of whom has their own slant. I remember me company needing to cultivate relationships with reporters to get favorable reporting on the national broadsheets. Reporters who consistently displayed that they were contrarian would be frozen out, while reporters who were more amenable would be given access. Each reporter would report a different aspect of the same event. I remember there was a court case between two institutions. Depending on the news source, the court judgment was written as a victory for either party. The plaintiff was reported as having won, as they had received an injunction in their favor, while in the other side of the fence the defendant was reported to have won because they were not penalized. I've also worked in company propositions where I was required to put out truths, half-truths, and outright lies. It was somewhat disheartening to see the news reporters basically lap up whatever we wrote and just publish it wholesale. I later learned that they ran on such a tight schedule that they had no time to countercheck or challenge anything we put out. They were constantly in a rush to get the scoop, since about 5 other news sources were going to publish it too. Ever since I learned how the news really works, I have not trusted any news source. Hence the importance of a taxpayer-funded public broadcaster that is itself not run by the government. Examples: B, Ek, Mac, and many more. This is not the same thing as a state broadcaster. Edit. A couple of people pointed out some flaws in the EKPK. Has an ombudsman to report such flaws to? I'm sure can also do. Hot news. People don't trust liars. Is there a scientific basis showing a benefit in trusting the government? Seems like it would be the opposite, and having a distrust for government or authority figures is a healthy skepticism to hold rather than just trusting everything and everyone. I'm not religious, but amen, brother, preach. Our faith has been eroded by bad actors in politics, not the news itself. Quite a lot of news are bad actors, though. Silly of you to think the news and government are not colluding against our citizens to push stories and suppress truth. How many conspiracy theories turned out to be true? Is it extremely dangerous to our democracy? People should have faith in government institutions. History has shown repeatedly that government does not have the best interests of its subjects at heart. Removed. Yes. This is why Russia and other foreign interests heavily invest in producing and disseminating this information. Also, countries like China and Russia clamp down hard on information control. They monitor most of their internet and make sure only the state-approved messages are allowed to spread. They know damn well how powerful information is. Unfortunately, freedom of information cannot exist without some form of rules and regulations that prevent powerful entities from abusing it. That means someone has to police the media. Without police, you get rampant criminal activity. That should be a self-evident fact. The 2016 US presidential campaign and its contemporary across-the-pond Brexit were both successful Russian disinformation campaigns. Fortunately, they appear to not have been as successful as Putin hoped, and he decided to go ahead with his plans to invade Ukraine despite failing to distract the Gus and Ok, and his army is now paying a heavy price for his sunk cost fallacy. How? I think democratic institutions are doing a pretty good job of discrediting themselves. So do credible news sources. The audacity. There are reputable studies that show we don't have representation in our government. The lobbyists have total control. Nobody represents the working class anymore. Shit's a joke nowadays. There was this one dude, just saying. They want to turn us against one another. Since when is questioning authority an existential threat to democracy? You should erode faith in institutions. The only thing that should have your faith is facts, principles, and reality. The whole premise is predicated on the fact that the people should trust the institutions implicitly. Who in their right mind thinks that is a good idea? Since the UK's Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump as US president in 2016, fake news has become a significant source of concern, with most commentators worrying about the uptake of false information by the consumers of fake news. Translation. After generations of dominance in controlling the mass media, we now find our credibility so tarnished that large swaths of the population no longer trust us on anything. Our bad reporting and disinformation, which we never partake in, are labeled as editorial errors and swept up with a correction days later. Their bad reporting and disinformation is a direct affront to our most cherished institutions. Yes, that's one issue. Another issue is that news media is supposed to challenge politicians rather than just serving as their mouthpiece and repeating everything they say and taking it at face value while never ever mentioning their donors. Think they eroded their own trust a long time ago. The internet just does forget, like an old newspapers and the zeitgeist of the public. Had they knew what the internet was going to become, they would have stopped it in the 90s. In the past, censorship worked by blocking the flow. Censorship information worked by blocking the in the 21st century, censorship works by flooding people with irrelevant information. In ancient times, having power meant having access to data. Today, having power means knowing what to ignore. Yuval Noah Harari. Faith in democratic institutions eroding. I'm way ahead of you their article. They don't represent any of us. They only represent the interest of the corporation that's giving them money. Maybe fulfill campaign promises instead of coddling corporations. Or maybe people are losing faith in democratic institutions because of the prolonged and blatant corruption plaguing every level of our governmental system. Removed. 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 I agree with the findings. That said, the term faith is ridiculous and needs to stop being twisted as having some sort of positive connotation. Believing something with zero evidence, the definition of faith, is as moronic and counterproductive as burning books. It is a failing every time. People living in imagination land are constantly and easily manipulated by sociopaths. If you have faith in democratic institutions, then you aren't paying attention. The faith in democratic institutions is only exactly as strong as the integrity of the people in power of these institutions. I don't really see much integrity in anything these days regarding a lot of democratic institutions. Just saying. In the United States, at least, people have valid reasons to distrust the institutions when it comes to democracy. They mean by think and after. Difference between conspiracy theory and fact has been about 6 months. Removed. Governments have been lying to people for millennia, so biz as usual. Removed. What I'm hearing is that if government officials weren't so corrupt, more people would have faith in the institution they represent. Quotes 100 news channels simultaneously. This is a threat to our democracy. If our undemocratic institutions had failed us repeatedly for 3 decades, then perhaps people would be so open to getting their news and information from non-official sources. There's a reason no one trusts government agencies, and it's not because of misinformation. It's because of their incompetence. If only we had some sort of government agency to decide for us what news is or isn't fake. We could call it maybe the Cabinet of Truthiness or the, oh, Ministry of. I don't know. We can work on the name later. But the point is, we desperately need such an organization. The Nazis set up something similar. They had their own depth of misinformation. Well, it is pretty obvious to me the US government is just 3 industries in a trench coat, and it is actively decimating the middle and working classes. Removed. Removed. Probably true. Other than this post, I believe almost nothing I read online. At least not at face value. The real news itself is fake enough lately to cause a loss of public trust. Removed. Removed. If the institutions acted in a trustworthy and open way, it would matter. Instead, we have all sorts of behind-the-scenes chicanery and obfuscation that makes the institutions untrustworthy. Removed. I think it's the lies and blatant corruption that made me lose faith in our democratic institutions. Yeah, no, things like destroying the Middle East to get revenge for a Saudi-funded plot while simultaneously supporting the Saudis. Removed. Cynicism is not skepticism. Government is the largest purveyor of misinformation, and corporate legacy media the largest disseminators of that misinformation. Guft trying to censor views or opinions it does like is the inmates running the asylum.